Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. So we're going to take a look at the results of Week 11. There were some interesting results as we try to figure out who stays on our Survivor Island. And we're going to take a look at some of the biggest games left in the regular season in the CFP race. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. As always, take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe. We always appreciate that when you do. So Week 11 is in the books. But before we get to that, Shehan, how's your week been? I mean, we're just this is like that moment in early November, at least for those of us who are really in depth in the sport, where it's kind of like, okay, just got to get that second win because it is exciting. First of all, it's more exciting than it's ever been, but then, you get the big rush once we get closer, I think, to like rivalry weekend, the energy pumps up again. How are you?
It's interesting because, the last 2 weeks before this, I went to games. I was at SMU Pitt, and before that, I was at A&M LSU. And this past week, I just worked from home, and I was just like, I need a breather, man. I just need to have a game. I need to have a week where I can just kind of sit back, watch the games. Thankfully, outside of that BYU Utah game, which was a great game, there wasn't too much that went too late this weekend too. So at least for my main responsibilities, I could mostly be done by 9 or 10 Central Time. So like we're getting to the home stretch. I think that this is the point of the year too where I'm like a little like, okay, it makes it a little easier that we mostly know what teams we're working with. Now, again, in this era, and I think this is great, it's more like 25 teams that we know that we're working with instead of like 7. I think that that's great, but it's better than having to, just from a peer coverage perspective, it's better and a little easier than having to be like, all right, the 78th team is paying attention to the 101st team, and you got to pay really, really close attention to that. I think that we kind of like have narratives that the other thing too is obviously I put together a ballot every week for the CBS 134 rankings, so ranking every single team. And this is kind of the point where you're like, all right, you're more tweaking. You don't have to sit there and like, yes, you check every single result, certainly, but like, you don't have to like reorder 80% of the ballot every single week, right? Like teams are kind of set in what they are. Maybe they go up because they got a big win. Maybe they drop a little bit because they lost, but like, you're not having to be like, who I don't know what to do with with Virginia, right? Like cuz you kind of have their place in the world set a little bit more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny, this weekend I had to go to California, to Los Angeles, just for an award ceremony, totally unrelated to this, but I'm like, you know what, I'm in the area, I'm going to cover a game in the Rose Bowl. So I got a chance to go, because I'd been to the Rose Bowl before as a fan. I've sent people to cover the actual Rose Bowl game. And I've been to the Rose Bowl both for UCLA game as a fan and as the Rose Bowl game itself. But I'm like, I really want to cover this inside. One thing I'd heard about, and the people who've covered it for me have said it's really strange to get to the field. The fastest way is to go through the crowd. I'm like, that sounds really strange, but it's an old stadium, maybe. So again, it was a great game. UCLA, Iowa, not obviously any championship consideration, but UCLA is trending up after that a 5-game losing streak that actually ended up being against teams that were incredible. Like losing their second game to Indiana seemed like an awful thing at the time. Now, okay, that's forgivable. Losing to Ohio State, losing to Oregon. Again, every team has been ranked except for a winning Minnesota team. But going to that game, seeing that energy, which was remarkable, I have to say, I was definitely undersold on the UCLA in-game experience, especially when they get their energy up. Although again, maybe half the stadium was Iowa fans. But yeah, no, to get down there, I followed the UCLA beat writers, really cool. They said like, follow us, and we went through the crowd and got onto the field, which was kind of a surreal way to do it. But those older stadiums don't quite have all the dedicated elevators and all that stuff in the back. But yeah, it definitely, though, you could tell just from the energy, it's like we're now just kind of in that wonderful early November as we all try to get our energy. But all of that said, the week didn't disappoint at all. Like it's one thing to sit here and complain about, oh, there's so much college football, but that's wonderful even in a bad day. And this weekend was full of excitement. So just to kind of, again, bring everyone up to speed, the way this show works, we have a 12-member island, a college football survivor island. These are the 12 teams that we're going to focus on each week. We can have a maximum of 12, and then each week we have to vote off one team. We must vote off one team. We can vote off more than one team, but no matter what, even if everybody wins, we have to vote someone off. Luckily, we had a couple of losses this week, and maybe we may not even go to them as far as voting them off. After we vote someone off, we decide if we're going to let anyone back on, maybe from the rest of the pool or maybe a team that used to be on our list. And then because of the 12-team playoff, we've added a couple of interesting requirements because we have to have at least 5 conference champions into the playoff. And now I feel like I got to rephrase it almost, but we're at this point saying we have to have a member of each of the P4 conferences and then one member from the G5, as most 12-team playoff years would turn out. So if we remove all the members of one of those conferences or all of the G5s, we have to go back and add another one. In addition, so we don't pick on the G5, which we certainly haven't this first season, if we remove the G5 team, we have to replace also one of the other 11 teams from typically the P4 ranks. So all that said, it's been a really interesting thing to see kind of go in action. I mean, way off on the horizon, we've had some teams that may have played themselves out of consideration in the long run, with Iowa State taking a second loss, Pitt taking a second loss, and some arguments about LSU. I mean, certainly as an at-large seems to have worked their way out. But the teams we had heading into week 11 were Oregon, and I'm just going to go with the CFP ranking like everything else does. We had Oregon, which of course defeated Maryland. It was a game early, but the final score was very remarkable. It was only 1 point off from their win over Michigan the previous week. Ohio State, which had no problem shutting out Purdue. Georgia, which lost to Ole Miss, will be circling back to that one. Miami, which lost to Georgia Tech, will be coming back to that one as well. Texas, which had no problem. Florida was playing like a team that has a coach who had his season guaranteed for him at an inopportune time for perhaps continuing to compete. Penn State had no trouble with Washington in their whiteout. Tennessee had no trouble with a terrible Mississippi State team, although maybe we'll see. I think their quarterback may have been a little dinged up, but he's probably going to be coming back. Indiana had an interesting game against Michigan. BYU will be coming back to that Holy War victory because that was one to watch. And Shehan already mentioned that earlier. And then we had, of course, had Notre Dame, which had the biggest margin of victory in FBS against Florida State. I am still the only thing that's worth noting is just Florida State. Holy cow. Like no other team in FBS beat the other team as badly as Notre Dame beat the Noles. And then finally, of course, actually we have Boise State, which had a closer than expected game with Nevada. But of course, Nevada gave SMU, which is our last team, a heck of a game in the opener this season. And then SMU, which had a bye, just kind of kicking back and wondering how they ended up at this number 13 in this ranking. So all of that said, how do you think our field did this week, Shehan?
Yeah, I mean, obviously some real big things happened essentially, right? This is such an interesting week. I mean, we haven't had very many weeks where legit top 5 teams are losing. And actually, I will say too, right? Like obviously we expressed our dissatisfaction with some of the way that the top 10 of the rankings went last week, but it means that we're going to see a legitimate reordering in some ways of what happens this week, because like Georgia, like how far does Georgia fall? That I think is going to be one of the most interesting questions, because like you look at their win obviously against Texas, it's one of the best wins in the entire country. Also, the rest of their resume is not very good. And now they have an 18-point loss to Ole Miss on their record as well. And Ole Miss, by the way, has had plenty of their own issues this year. They're going to have a fascinating case when it comes time around. So I don't know. I think this is what you want if you are the college football playoff. This is what you want if you are a fan, especially a casual fan who's really watching this and wanting to see movement and see upsets. But I mean, again, it makes this even more complicated, even more difficult. I mean, for goodness sake, we were really, really close to having both undefeated teams in the ACC and the Big 12 both lose, which to me would have cemented the fact that there will only be one team from each league in the field. And by the way, Iowa State was the other team. Iowa State down the board lost a game. So now every team outside of BYU in the Big 12 has at least 2 losses, and I would argue are eliminated from at-large contention for the playoffs. So really consequential week at the end of it.
Yeah, for sure. So let's have a conversation here. We have to eliminate someone. We have at least 2 teams that lost, although I'm not sure they were pretty high to begin with. I mean, Georgia again, they lost pretty convincingly to Ole Miss. Ole Miss finally, and last season we all remember Lane Kiffin's post game, said like we need better guys, we need better people to match up with who Georgia is, and it was interesting too because for a while there in not necessarily last season, in previous seasons, there was a sense that Michigan was building teams that could defeat Ohio State, but not necessarily do well in the playoff. And then last season, it all came together in that final culmination of the Harbaugh era. To some extent, it almost feels like this is exactly what Ole Miss has been planning for all offseason. We want to make a team that can beat Georgia. And granted, maybe lose a couple of other games, but dang it, when it came to playing Georgia, they performed exactly as advertised. And that was what was remarkable. Now, Georgia, again, maybe some of the luster is off after, of course, that Alabama loss, where the first half certainly is not fading from memory before they obviously had a near comeback in the second half of that game. But also, we've seen the problems they've had on offense. Obviously, Carson Beck. Yeah, it was interesting too. I was listening to a conversation on Carson Beck and players and especially quarterbacks who've gone into a season with high hopes. You know, it was basically him and Shador Sanders with the conversation of the preseason in terms of who seemed to have the most, basically the coronation towards their NFL dreams. Someone drew a comparison to Matt Barkley at USC when he decided to return. I thought it wasn't a bad comparison because he seemed like he had a top 10 pick ready, waiting for him, but he decided to return for unfinished business in a season that was a complete disaster for the Trojans under Lane Kiffin. But now it's interesting to watch them. So I am curious what you make of Georgia. I'm not saying like we're going to just let's go kick them off. But I mean, what is this? Is this a bigger concern? I mean, first of all, it's a little embarrassing for College Game Day. I have a feeling they had pre-planned this game in advance. And I was reading, again, this is all hearsay, that apparently it's just hard to even book out Athens in a way to host the show there. So they were like, we'll lock that down. That Tennessee game will be good. Well, it was great because when they announced it, it's going to be a top 10 matchup before the AP poll came out and pushed Georgia out of the top 10. So they're now 11. We'll see what the CFP says. They're a whole other kettle of fish. What do you think of them? Do you think Georgia is in a position to remain in our island?
Well, and you said it off the top, like obviously we're not definitely kicking them off right now, but like I think that we have to think about it. Like I think that we legitimately have to think about it. Georgia over the past 3 to 4 years has essentially taken the role of Alabama in college football. And for good reason, right? 21, 22, they win the national title. 23, they have a team that's certainly capable of winning the national title and just get upset in the SEC title game. I don't think that this is that kind of team. I don't. We're going to sit here and frankly, I kind of think that the committee might sit there too and treat them like it is 2022 again, even though this team has all sorts of issues everywhere, frankly. And I'm not going to vote right this second to kick them out. I will say they got second place in our poll of who should be removed at 31.4%. That's a legitimate amount of people. Almost a third of our voters said, now Georgia maybe needs to be out of here. And I think that they are onto something. Because look, when you look at their resume too, I want to look at 2 pieces of Georgia. One, I want to look at their resume. So they beat Texas at Texas, one of the best wins in the entire country this year. Absolutely, 100%. They lost to Alabama in a loss that, like, on the scoreboard, it's going to be 7 points. That was a really bad performance by them. And then, of course, they have this 18-point loss to Ole Miss. I mean, 18 is a lot of points, man. That's a lot of points to lose. And then on top of that, they were down to Florida when DJ Lagway got hurt. They let up 31 points to Mississippi State, which is the most points that Mississippi State has scored against any power conference team this season.
Wow.
They were potentially a field goal away from losing to Kentucky if Mark Stoops goes for it instead of punting it away, right? Like, and they have that win over Clemson in week 1. That I think has been a thing that's buoyed them a lot. But like Clemson ain't exactly covering themselves in glory this year. They had that really nice stretch in the middle of the year where they seemed to bounce back. Turns out it was mostly just playing a lot of bad teams. Turns out it was mostly just playing a lot of teams that might not even make bowl games. So I don't know exactly how strong Georgia's case is right now. The thing I'll say, they played 3 games, and if they beat Tennessee this week, right now, number 7 in the CFP rankings, they're in. Like, they're fine. And we'll have that conversation. I think that's actually going to be a really interesting game. I would have just defaulted, well, it's Georgia. They're going to win. I don't know exactly how confident I feel about that after the way they've played the past few weeks. But if they win that game, I think they're in. I think that they'll be maybe the top or maybe second highest ranked 2-loss team, along with Alabama probably being in that range. Alabama, by the way, has 4 ranked victories at this point, which is kind of crazy. But if they lose that game, they shouldn't even, like, they're done. They should not be part of our conversation. And I think that this is a piece, right? People come to me all the time and say, I think that there's like this brand bias of the college football playoff that, you know, they look at some teams and they're like, wow, that's impressive. And they look at other teams and they're like, well, who cares? You know, even people told me, like, with Miami being number 4, stuff like that. I don't think that it's that there's brand bias. I don't think it's that exactly. I think that they look at teams and carry over some preconceived notions of previous years. So we saw this obviously with some Alabama teams that weren't elite, that were still treated like elite Alabama teams. And I think that's one reason, too, why you look at a team like Indiana or you look at a team like BYU. It's not just that they're being evaluated on this season. It's that I think the committee also watches them and is like, well, this is the same team. These are some of the same people that were not very good last year. Like, how much could they have really improved year over year? And I'm not even saying that it's unfair to think that way, but like, we have to get over this idea that Georgia is just this ultimate good team. Because just for a second, again, to touch on some of their issues, right? Defensively, they are not what they have been. They're good. They're still good, but they are not what they've been. They don't stop the run at the same level that they did. Their secondary, outside of Malachi Starks, is not awesome. Now, they've been good enough rushing the passer that I don't think it's mattered in a lot of their games. But when they play teams that are a little better and can protect a little better downfield, like, I just don't love that matchup for them with the way that they're playing in the secondary. But the bigger issue for them is that they cannot run the ball. They last year were number 3 in the SEC in rushing offense. Right now, they're 15th out of 16. And Carson Beck after the game, and Carson Beck's been terrible. Just let's be clear. Carson Beck's been terrible. He probably should not be giving diagnoses on why the offense is struggling that don't have to do with him. But also, he's not wrong about this. Georgia is built to be a run offense that passes off of the run offense, right? Like, they're made to be a play action team. Well, when they don't have that run threat, which they haven't had in 2024, then all of a sudden Carson Beck has to go out there and try to make things happen with a receiving core that just frankly is not very good, has no easy buttons on it like they did the last couple of years with Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers. Like, we need to get past this idea that, oh, well, it's Georgia. They're Georgia. Like, I even had a conversation this morning with some people, and they were like, oh, well, you know, how do you think that I think it was Penn State matches up with, like, top teams like Alabama and Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon? And I'm like, hold on a second. We have to get past this idea of just defaulting Georgia there because they're there. I mean, frankly, we have to get past this idea of defaulting Alabama there in some ways too, but that's a whole other conversation. Georgia is still in. I'm not voting them out, but like, they are on the thinnest of ice right now. And if they lose this week at home to Tennessee, which is very possible, they're done.
Yeah, certainly the issues that Georgia's had on offense are not going to go well with the Tennessee defense. Now, the Tennessee offense is a whole other question altogether, but it's going to be an interesting game to see and how that works out. And I'm just going to say, the end of their regular season, the rivalry with Georgia Tech depends on what Georgia Tech shows up, which kind of leads us to the next team we should probably discuss. Miami. My goodness. They've been playing with fire all season long. That Cal game, really, I just thought people were just looking past it. They're over. I still think people are overselling the travel issues. I still do, and I think that
Well, you
you
did the
don't.
road game. You did the 2 hour time difference thing, and you covered that UCLA game just fine.
Yeah, because all
No
the
body
physical
clock
energy that
issues.
goes into that. Yeah, but at the same time, though, I mean, I just thought I'm like, okay, all right, I got it. But should Cal have gotten that close, especially from what we know about Cal, the only team to have lost to Florida State at this point? Maybe that was a travel. Who knows? I'm actually maybe making my own argument, right? But at the same time, what the games we've seen, the close ones. It just felt like we were watching Miami and to a lesser extent BYU. They can't keep getting away with this. Well, apparently both of them couldn't. And this was Miami's turn. But the sheer talent level of Miami is what also made it frustrating. Watching them play. Now, they still have everybody on that team that we've talked about. I'm not blaming Cam Ward for that loss. I don't think the problem is they just simply can't. The defense is just not pulling their weight. They've been able to put up enough points in every game. But seeing what Georgia Tech did to them, watching them just play their ball, it was fascinating. It was literally like it reminded me a bit of the opener in Ireland. It was like watching a team that was low expectations for Georgia Tech, and that's when they seem to thrive. And that's why again, Georgia, look out. That's the moment where they seem to go in and just have no trouble. What do we do with Miami? How do you diagnose them? Now, the AP dropped them to number 12, right behind Georgia. So they both they just literally moved back to back down to where they are. Be very curious to see where the CFP places them. What do you make of the Canes?
I'd say that along with Georgia, Miami is probably the team that I'm most interested to see where they're ranked this week because it has huge implications for the ACC, I would argue. Because if they're in a situation like you said where they drop to number 12 in the rankings, then that means that the ACC is officially a one bid league because it would be 12 Miami and then in the AP it's been 13/14 SMU. So I think that that's a risk. Certainly, that's a risk. For me, I think what's interesting, right? So we've talked before. We have to have an ACC team in the field, but we already have SMU in as well.
Mhm.
So we got our coverage. The question, I think, well, there's two pieces, right? One, how do we stack up SMU versus Miami? And do we think that SMU can beat Miami? Because if we do, then it makes it a lot easier to kick Miami out of the field, right? I'll even say, just to jump ahead for 1 second, we're also going to quickly talk about BYU, who managed to survive on a very controversial defensive holding call that kind of helped spur things. But they are still undefeated. You would much rather have a controversial call and come out with the win because that's going to get forgotten about in a different kind of way than if you lose and have a 1 on your record. But I think that for BYU, part of the case against is Iowa State lost and is a 2-loss Big 12 team. So there's not really a great case for anybody else to be in over them if we have to replace them with another Big 12 team. So I think it's much easier to kick Miami out because there is that other contender there. SMU is ready to go. And by the way, they have an offense that can keep up with Miami and a defense that's playing a lot better than what Miami's putting forward right now. Now, I think that when you look at Miami, like you said, this is a multi-week sort of thing. This is a multi-week sort of issue where they're playing these close games. Duke ultimately lost control and Miami pulled away, but that was a close game through the third quarter. I think Louisville, right? That was a messy game. Cal, that came down to the last possession. Virginia Tech, that came down to an overturned Hail Mary call. This isn't a 1 or 2 week thing. This is week after week after week they're in this position. They're still in decent shape to make the ACC title game. But let me just ask you real quick. It's going to come down to tiebreakers if everybody wins out, right? If Clemson wins out, and Pitt's in that group as well, but they've got a little bit more of a complicated path. But if Clemson, SMU, Miami all win out, SMU's in. I think that Miami would have the tiebreaker with Clemson. But let's just say hypothetically that Miami gets left out and is 11-1. I mean, like I don't know how good their at large case is, especially versus some of the teams that have a chance to jump up.
Yeah, they are one of the schools that has been absolutely hosed by Florida State completely not being what they were
Yeah.
supposed to do. That's when they went into the season, you kind of circle Louisville, you circle Florida State, you're like, all right, those will be good things to build up that resume. Florida, not a lot of expectations. Maybe Syracuse if things get going, and they still have that one, and we might talk about it in the second half of the show, but yeah, they really don't have a lot to hang their hat on. And you feel a little bit sympathy for the Canes only because that wasn't their fault. They're not the ones that are losing every game except the Cal. Or pardon me, losing every, yeah. So, gosh, the thing that strikes me is I feel like SMU had the worst week to have a bye game because when the AP re-ranked it, they just pushed them down 1-2.
Yeah,
And
which is
SMU's like,
ridiculous to me.
what did
Yeah,
they do? What
ridiculous.
did we even do in all of this? You don't have to make room for another SEC team. So I'm very curious to see what the CFP is going to do on Tuesday when they get back together again, because I feel like they are being a little bit hosed. I have to say though, with our with our Big 12 and ACC teams, we are kind of in a situation where it's like, who do we think would ultimately win out? Um, I don't know if you bring up the great question about being an at large. I don't know if somehow Miami gets boxed out of the championship, would they be able to get in based on that resume? I think at this point, it's a little early to make that assumption. I don't feel comfortable making that assumption. I think I felt comfortable with them losing the ACC title game and getting in, but at this point, being left out entirely, they would need, I think, that extra win on their resume. I don't know. I think SMU is a little bit better built to battle them in a game right now, especially if they went head to head, which would make me want to keep them there. Now, I feel like this is somewhat in parallel, although they isn't a zero sum game with the BYU question. Now, BYU is obviously the only undefeated left. Iowa State losing again has left us with the hilarious scenario where the other team is now Colorado. And with Colorado, though, I'm now wondering, like, if I took Colorado and BYU and put them up against each other, which team do I think would win that?
It would be a good game.
To be fair, I I don't feel like you could even say, well, BYU would lose because everyone's been saying that all year long, and they still managed to win. So I almost feel like that's their strength.
I do want to say one thing. Okay, so obviously BYU is being grouped in with Miami as like oh, they're always in close games. Oh, they always come so close to losing, and like I have to push back on that a little bit. So Oklahoma State, right? That was a game that they needed the last second thing to happen. Utah, of course, this past week they needed, but like they've won most of their games by multiple scores. Like, I don't know where this, like, everybody's like, oh my gosh, BYU's just 2022 TCU. They're just rioting by the seat of their. I don't know where this idea is coming from. Like, they have not played very many close games, right? And when they have, they've been ahead, and other teams have tried to make late runs. It hasn't been them having to be in all these close games because they're coming back. Like I think the stat was for Miami, right? It was Miami and Iowa State were the two teams that have come back 3 times from 10 plus deficits this year. That hasn't been BYU. Like BYU's been winning these games by good margins. 38-9 over Kansas State, 41-19 over Arizona, 37-24 against UCF. And like I think that there are ways to certainly like poke holes in BYU, but like we are just so far to me going in the direction of being like, oh, well, there are these frauds who keep getting away with it. And I'm like, I don't know, man. That just does not feel quite representative, even when you compare them to a team like Miami.
It is fascinating though, because I mean that's a great example. If they had the U on the side of their helmet, they would have been number 4, and people would have been said like, "Hey, they survived another tough rivalry game against Utah. That was just one for the ages. We can let that one pass." I think that's a pretty strong argument there. I think then I would have an easier time removing Miami, only because again it would feel so out of line. Because if we remove BYU, who's left? We would literally
Right.
the only other option would be Colorado, which seems
Yeah.
a little early to say the least. I mean, no disrespect to the Buffs. I mean, they had that game at Texas Tech was something else, but yeah, it's a little early for you guys. We probably may not have you guys really as a serious contender unless you win it all. But
So let me ask one thing real quick too. For BYU, I'm just curious, right? Because like you said, we're voting out Miami, we're keeping BYU in. I think that's the direction that we're going. Where do you think in the CFP rankings, where do you think that BYU turns up? Because it's a lot of weirdness ahead of them. They were number 7 in the AP, I'll say that. Of course, they were number 9 in last week's rankings. It was so interesting to me that Indiana, after, by the way, playing a close game against Michigan, moved into the top 5. BYU still stayed at number 7. Um, but ahead of them from last week, you had Miami and Georgia lose. That's 3 and 4. Do you think that they just move up to 7? Do you like? I don't know. I mean, I guess that maybe it just is as
I
simple as
wouldn't
like
be
they stick at
shocked if
7.
they just stay pat at number 9 and we watch Georgia and
You think
Miami just
Alabama
sit in
jumps
front
them
of them.
too? You think
Yeah,
like
maybe actually Alabama would. I think 100% would jump them. If they don't, I'd be
yeah,
shocked. That would not make any sense if they didn't had they with where they started this past week at number 11. So I think that
yeah,
would make a lot of sense to go ahead and push them up. Notre Dame, I'm not sure, but Indiana,
yeah,
I could see Georgia somehow. I'm curious to see where they rank Georgia. We're going to see a lot. I
yeah.
mean,
What if they're like 6? What if they're like 6 ahead of Indiana and BYU still? Like, I don't think it's impossible.
it isn't. That we've seen crazier.
So I think that at risk. So Miami's going to fall behind them. I feel very confident that Miami's going to fall behind them. But I think there's a case that, or not a case, because I don't think that there's a case. I think there's a chance that the committee still has Georgia ahead of them. I think there's a chance that they move Alabama ahead of them. Another team that's going to be fascinating to see how they deal with is Ole Miss. Ole Miss, of course, 2 losses, 2 pretty bad losses overall, especially after LSU lost, but they've got the Georgia win. And especially, by the way, if you've got 2 lost Georgia and 2 lost Ole Miss, they're going to be like, well, Georgia should stay ahead of BYU, but Ole Miss is better than Georgia, so let's move them. What if BYU staying undefeated moves down? I think it's definitely possible.
That would be fascinating. And there's no reason they have to stay in order. I mean, imagine, and again, if Boise State had a closer than comfortable game with Nevada, but imagine if they had actually just moved Boise State ahead of BYU this early in the game. We would have I can't even
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah.
That would have been fascinating. It would have been,
It's
I wouldn't say fantastic. I wouldn't be necessarily rooting for it,
yeah.
but it would
No,
be
no,
entertainment.
it would be frankly kind of awful. One thing that's fascinating too is like, so you look at their schedules, right? So I mean, BYU beat SMU in week 2, and then later in the year also beat Kansas State by a huge margin. But like SMU is kind of being treated as being in the same tier as BYU as a one-loss team. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting too. I feel like how narratively, I feel like with some of these, like with teams that people don't expect, right? Like it's almost like it feels like teams are sometimes given credit more for like having a slip up and coming back from it than, like, for example, we could be at a situation. Let's just say that BYU loses just one of their last 3 games, right? They play Kansas this week. Kansas is starting to play really well
Mhm.
right now. Let's say that they lose that, finish 12-1, win the Big 12. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if the committee's like, well, SMU really turned it on after that week 2 loss. And so actually that doesn't matter. We're going to move them ahead. Like, you just don't know. You just don't know right now with the way that BYU's been treated at this point.
I'm very curious to see where BYU lands and the explanation for it, and the way they've, you know, uh, if they stay firm, I could see them somehow deciding they should stay pat, but at the same time, maybe give them a pat on the back, like, it was a tough road win. It was a tough road rivalry win, or something like that. Oh, by the way, you're still at number 9. I mean, I don't know. I could see them talking to both sides of their mouth, a little bit there. But I'm fascinated to see that now. We have a spot open. We can vote a team on. We certainly have candidates here. Obviously, the 2 leading ones are Alabama with that just dominating win at LSU in the bootleg Tiger game. And then, of course, Ole Miss handled Georgia. So we have 2 teams and now Alabama started at number 11 in the CFP. So they were ranked a little bit higher than Ole Miss. And Ole Miss, understandably so, it was number 16 because people just were wondering if this is just another season of Ole Miss kind of not reaching their potential. But here we have Ole Miss beating the higher ranked team, the CFP number 3, and Alabama just manhandling the number 15 LSU Tigers. It's an interesting question. I mean, should we only take one of them? Because if we'd have to clear space in the top, and if so, which one should we take?
Yeah, this is a tough one, right? Because I think that you're in a position where you're weighing essentially what do you like more between Alabama and Ole Miss's resume. And like I think that Ole Miss certainly has played well. That's also why I'm very curious how high they jump in this next ranking. But I think that Alabama's case right now is just a lot better. I think that when you look at them, they have two really, really good victories. One at home against Georgia, one on the road against LSU. They also, I will say, I do not like value their. I do not value that Missouri game at all. Missouri's terrible. I that like if we want to their resume right now is just absolutely this is beside the point. This does not matter. But I think that for Alabama, right? Like they look good right now. They have, by the way, that win over South Carolina that actually isn't aging that badly. It turns out South Carolina was just better than we thought that they were when they played that game. So I think that they've done enough. Their two losses to this point are by 5 and 7 points on the road. Like, I think that Alabama's done enough to get into the field. Now, I still think that I'd have them close to the bottom if we did a ranking of them, but I think that they do deserve to be in.
Yeah, I think at this point, Alabama has that opportunity, and I think starting where they have at number 11 this late in the season at the CFP, I expect them to be the one to be in there, and Ole Miss might come close, but I'm curious to see. This is a good thing. I mean, we've talked about this. The controversy in the 12-team playoff is, of course, going to be the at-large berths at the bottom. So as we're gonna talk in the latter half of this episode, there are opportunities for all of these teams just to simply make it in and potentially even win everything, at least in their conference, with how chaotic the SEC is right now. But for now, I think I'm comfortable with moving Alabama up and with Ole Miss. It's interesting too because Alabama, of course, their next game is going to be an FCS game with Mercer. Even though they're number 7 in the FCS, I'm not expecting a whole lot out of that one. Ole Miss gets a bye, and then they're going on the road to Florida, so we're not going to necessarily see any. We're not going to see probably any movement from Ole Miss this upcoming week. Um, Alabama's final 2 games at Oklahoma and Auburn, Ole Miss, is at Florida and the Egg Bowl against a terrible Mississippi State team. Neither is going to really have an opportunity to put much out there other than seeing how the rest of the teams in the SEC do and hoping they can perhaps get into the title game. So this is an interesting predicament because I have a feeling that if we move Alabama in or Ole Miss in, we're not going to get really another opportunity to probably look at the other team up until unless they make it into the conference championship game. That said, I kind of agree with you. I think Alabama, especially Jalen Milroe, he had an excellent performance. We knew he's a good player. Just like last season, he's getting stronger as he goes along, it seems like. So, yeah, I'm with you. Let's go ahead and move the Alabama Crimson Tide back into because by the way, that was the only difference between our top 12, or our 12, but our Survivor Island and the top 12 of the CFP. We had SMU as our, whatever you want to call our 12th team. They had Alabama as their 11th team, and that was the difference. So fantastic stuff. Well, when we get back from the break, we're going to take a look at some of the important games coming up as the season kind of closes out, and teams that might influence the CFP rankings here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so obviously, the first thing we're going to say is we're not going to talk about the conference championship games. Those are obviously going to have a big impact. But we thought we'd take a look at, with these final several weeks, some of the important games that could make a difference in the CFP rankings. And I have to say, now, of course, we're not expecting, as we said, we're not expecting an FCS upset over an SEC team in their classic SEC FCS challenge that they have at this stage of the season. But we're talking about games that could make an impact that we are kind of going to pay attention to. Lots of great options out there. But before we go, I just want to say one thing, and this has been talked about a lot. The odds of this extremely low, but the opportunity of an SEC 8-way tie is still out there, and it is fantastic. Last week, I know in our CFB, we had someone paint that picture, and everyone said it's unlikely, and yet everything happened that needed to happen. Georgia lost to Ole Miss. LSU lost to Alabama. Mizzou beat Oklahoma, and that was by the skin of their teeth. I was just thinking when Sean said, like, oh, Mizzou's not going to make it. I'm like, well, it's been a crazy season so far. So if Georgia wins out, at this point, including a win at Tennessee, if Texas A&M somehow manages to lose to Auburn or and beat Texas, or Texas takes a loss and they lose to Texas, however that is. If Tennessee manages to lose at Georgia and win out against Mississippi State and Vandy, if Texas, depending on how the A&M thing works out, wins out against Florida, Arkansas, and Kentucky, LSU wins against Florida, Vanderbilt, and Oklahoma. And if Ole Miss wins out against Florida, Mississippi State, and Alabama wins out against Oklahoma and Auburn, and Mizzou wins out against South Carolina, which may be the hardest thing I've said in this entire thing, Mississippi State and Arkansas, we would have a glorious 2-loss tie at the top, which, as I just have to say, the tiebreakers get hilarious, but then suddenly Mississippi State becomes the ultimate nightmare for every SEC team that had them on the schedule, because the strength of schedule plummets for every team that ended up with the Bulldogs. I'm just saying that out there. We're not going to necessarily go through it, but I have to acknowledge it because it is one of the wackiest situations we've ever seen. It is like ACC coastal chaos has somehow spread into the SEC, but that's what you get when you have 8 conference games and 16 teams. Not enough of these guys play each other. If they had 9 conference games, probably wouldn't be the situation we'd be in right now.
So I do want to bring up one sort of guiding question for us, actually, as we head into this, which is, I'm curious, right? So you've got the SEC, which has all these quite good teams. You have the Big Ten, which really has a lot of mediocre to bad teams, but has 3 or 4 who are kind of standing above the rest of the field. Like, I'm curious from your perspective, which league would you rather be right now? Would you rather be one that has like 7 teams that could technically make the playoff, or would you rather kind of like have your champions in a way to put out there?
I think the Big Ten is in a better position because those are the champions are the ones that usually run through the whole thing. That's how it used to work when we had a 14 playoff. It's like, all right, you got all these teams. Then you got Alabama and Georgia and maybe, Ohio State and Clemson as the real teams that seem to have a chance. Maybe Oklahoma when they're, the paper tiger Oklahoma, that kind of goes up there. So I think that felt like more of what worked before. Now, in the situation of having a bunch of really good teams, none of which seem to necessarily have that edge, I don't know. I part of it is we're running into this classic situation we get late in the season where sometimes a conference seems stronger than it might be, and then we get to the bowl games, see these teams play each other. Although again, with some bowl games, some of the teams just aren't taking it all that seriously. Sometimes they're taking it, deadly serious, as Georgia did against Florida State last season. But sometimes you don't get that. The playoff is going to be fantastic. The 12-team playoff is going to be fantastic because now we're going to see at least several of these SEC teams, and none of which really are coming out as a world beater that we would guarantee like we had thought before the season. I'm very curious to see how they work out when we actually throw them into the mix. Of course, it could very well be some of them playing each other, but I'm fascinated to see how it shakes out once this 12-team playoff actually grabs some of them and we see them all really playing for a championship.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. And, we're going to get some idea of how this works out too when we head into the playoff. And we have these teams that, I think you could make the case are a little more battle tested, right? Alabama's played so many bigger games than anybody in the Big Ten. The Big Ten, right? You have kind of in a sense, you can almost compare it like what the Big Ten has right now is kind of the Michigan proposition from last year, where they were kind of able to use a lot of the season to ramp themselves up and get themselves ready. And it was time. Yeah, I don't know. It was really, really interesting. So, yeah, I I think that if I'm a league right now, and if I'm a team, like I'm probably digging where the Big Ten is. I mean, they're going to have what, three of the top four teams in the rankings, probably. Like it's kind of crazy that they've reached this point. And I think the other thing too, and this is something that I think is going to be fascinating with super conferences in general, is yeah, it's fun to have all these big brands and powerful teams as part of your league, but like that means that you're going to lose a lot. I mean, Georgia losing again, if they lose this weekend, it will be 3 losses for Georgia in the regular season and missing out on a conference championship game. Like, it's going to be a little bit of a new world in the SEC versus the Big Ten. And look, maybe it pays off because you have so many more national title contenders, but like it didn't last year. Last year, even with the teams who were going to enter the SEC, none of them were top 2. None of them turned up in the national title game, rather. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic to keep an eye on. And again, certainly you expect the teams that make it through are going to be battle tested. But by the way, I mean, think about a team like Georgia, who already is dealing with offensive line injuries, and like, I don't know. It's going to be an interesting kind of situation as the season comes to a close.
Yeah, so as we talk about some of the games we're looking forward to, I mean, certainly with Georgia, that Tennessee game this upcoming week, we've already kind of talked about it, is in many ways basically a playoff elimination game. At least it could be. Or well, is it though? Actually, now I'm saying that it's a fascinating game, but for Georgia, could that eliminate them? I mean, would a 3-loss Georgia team ever be able to make it back up? Because if they are out of the SEC title game, I don't see a way they could. Especially if they drop to as low as they have in the AP poll, which is kind of teetering at the edge of the top 12.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think that we have been conditioned for the entire offseason essentially to get ready for the 9-3 SEC team to make the field, or the 9-3 Big Ten team to make the field. I don't really see that happening right now. There are just so many teams that have 2 losses. I just think that honestly, like these teams are kind of in trouble if you pick up a 3rd loss. Now, listen, never say never. I will say never about LSU. We had a little bit of this conversation before the show. I think LSU's done. They have nothing impressive on their resume outside of a really close game against Ole Miss. That's it. Everything else about their resume sucks. Georgia's a little different because they do have the Clemson game. They do have the Texas game, which is maybe the most impressive win in the country this year. I still think, though, once you pick up a 3rd loss, it's just a lot of losses, man. Like you have lost 1/4 of the games on your schedule. That's a lot of the games on your schedule to lose, and just kind of be passed over. And by the way, like if we want to talk, I mean, I'd be fascinated, for example, if we get to this point where like SMU as an ACC title game loser to Miami versus 3-loss Georgia, like I think that SMU should have a decent case in that scenario if it's a close game. I don't know. I mean, if BYU loses in the Big 12 title game and is 1 loss, like I just can't see it. Well, actually, I can see a scenario. I would prefer not to see a scenario where 12-1 BYU gets left out for 9-3 Georgia.
Oof.
with 2 top 20 wins on their schedule. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like they're done. I think, though, that this is the other thing, too, which is, so you mentioned all those teams that have the potential right now to finish with 2 losses in the SEC. And I'm gonna quickly pull up the SEC standings, not to try to work through the tiebreaker. That's that I think is something that we can get to that bridge if we get there. But let's look at the amount of 2-loss teams. Okay, so let's just say hypothetically that Georgia beats Tennessee this week. The only 1-loss team would be Texas. Obviously, they'd be cleanly in, although they would play in a conference championship game and have an opportunity to potentially pick up a 2nd loss. But then we're in a scenario where in the SEC, like we kind of talked about, right? Missouri, Ole Miss, Alabama, Georgia, Texas A&M, Tennessee. That's 6 teams that could have 2 losses. Somebody's going to lose another because of the conference championship game, although Texas losing it and becoming another 2-loss team would be hilarious. So you'd get 1 in guaranteed with Texas. Like that team would be in. I think that Texas, if they beat Texas A&M, they're a lock. I think it's over. But that, I mean, we're not getting 7 SEC teams in the field, right? Like, that's not happening just because of pure math. And so you're in a position where I think you have to start prioritizing who those 2 lost teams are going to be. I think Alabama would probably be the top priority 2 lost team. By the way, some of this math is messed up because Texas A&M plays Tech, so one of them has to lose and pick up a second loss. But point is, like, I think Alabama probably is high priority. I think if Georgia stays at 2 losses, they're high priority. But man, it's like, if you are a middle tier 2-loss team in the SEC, I mean, I kind of feel like your path might be hard because you're going to be contending with 3 teams who I think are locks in the Big Ten. That would be Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State. I think that an 11-1 Indiana is probably okay. 11-1 Notre Dame is probably where it gets interesting when you're like Ole Miss versus Notre Dame. That's going to be an interesting conversation. We might actually learn some about that this week, but I don't think that there's space for Missouri, right? After Missouri beats Oklahoma this week, and by the way, a terrible game where they looked awful, and I think it was embarrassing for them. And Eli Drinkwitz decided to come out and talk crap anyway because that's what Eli Drinkwitz does. Like Eli Drinkwitz after the game, like said to the broadcast, like, "Yeah, we stayed in the playoff hunt." It's like, I mean, like in the way that you technically are a college football team and can be selected, sure, but like, I mean, again, unless they find a way to win the conference, I don't know that that's the case. I don't know that, that Missouri's actually part of this. So I don't know. All that to say, it gets weird. It gets weird.
Yeah. I love when he dismissed LSU. All I keep thinking of in 2007, they were the ones that somehow climbed out of the pile. So sometimes that's all you got to be. You just got to climb out of the pile.
Gosh.
But yeah. It's fascinating because obviously the SEC has plenty of games that we want to keep an eye on. Obviously, we just mentioned Tennessee and Georgia, Texas and Texas A&M, absolutely. Although I do wonder how much value we're giving the Texas again. When they play tough teams, they seem to, the one tough team they seem to play, they struggled with and lost, and the rest, they seem to do well against mid-tier teams like Florida. Obviously, again, the Ole Miss at Florida game will be a little interesting to see because Ole Miss, that I'm not sure who else could possibly challenge. The Mississippi State ain't going to be the ones likely to challenge, although, they will get strange, but probably not that strange this season. But leaving the SEC with a special shout out to that Georgia Tech Georgia game we mentioned earlier. Indiana and Ohio State's going to be one in the circle. I mean, there's so many good games coming up in a couple of weeks on the 23rd. We have that. Again, the Ole Miss at Florida game. We have BYU at Arizona State, which could be one of their last true challenges. Kansas could be tough. It's at home. Houston's just a complete mystery team. They could show up and be great or they could not. But that road game at Arizona State, that may be the last real true challenge for the Cougs before the Big 12 title game. And we also have that fascinating game, which could, really put another G5 team on the map. And that's the Army at Notre Dame game. Because again, Army managed to survive North Texas in a very Army way. They just basically wrestled them to the ground and held them there with that nearly 14-minute drive to win 14-3, probably 13-minute drive to win 14-3. But those are going to be some interesting. But which one do you think, Indiana, Ohio State, do you think that the loser of that game still is in the playoff hunt? A potentially 2-loss Ohio State or a 1-loss Indiana?
I think so. Ohio State's going to get held up a little bit because at least they beat Penn State. If they lose that game, then I think that like they are in elimination mode. But I do think that they would still be in, not cleanly. It wouldn't be awesome, but like I think that the other piece of this too is that if Indiana wins and goes to the Big Ten title game, and let's say they lose to Oregon in that game, like 12-1 Indiana with their only loss being to the number 1 team in the country is like number 2, like, or number 3. Like that's the level that they're actually, they probably would be number 2 because Texas would be the only team that would even have a chance in that scenario to contend for number 2. So like if your losses are to number 1 and number 2 and you have a win over number 5 or 6, like you're fine. Indiana, if they lose, they're still, I think, in. especially, by the way, with the amount of 2-loss SEC teams. If there were more 1-loss SEC teams, I think that they'd be in a little more trouble. But Indiana, in my opinion, will still be ahead of Notre Dame. They'll still be ahead of a lot of the 2-loss SEC teams. I think right now they'd probably be ahead of Georgia, probably be ahead of Ole Miss, Texas A&M. So I think that Indiana should be okay, but their path is definitely a little more tenuous, whereas Ohio State has the benefit of that win over Penn State.
One team that we haven't really mentioned as much, but could fight their way back into at least ACC contention is Clemson. But they have one of the toughest things ahead of them because they have to play South Carolina, which is, we've
Yep.
talked about. No one wants to play South Carolina right now, but they also get a game at Pitt. Now, I know Pitt is reeling. They've now lost 2 in a row. That Clemson at Pitt game that's actually coming up this weekend might be an interesting one to keep an eye on, only because we're talking about how the rest of the ACC, and to a lesser extent the Big 12, because I'll also mention next week's Colorado and Kansas game, how they're going to kind of work their way out. Because again, as we said, if Clemson and Miami are in a beauty contest now to see if they can win out to be the 1-loss ACC team in there, that Clemson at Pitt game is going to be quite important to be part of it. I'm having trouble trying to figure out what other games in that. I mean, Miami at Syracuse, clearly to close the regular season. We mentioned that in the first half of the show is also going to be important. We're in an interesting beauty race right now in the ACC to see who can push their way through if we end up with tiebreakers in that conference.
Yeah, I think that if things hold as they do right now, I believe Miami would have the advantage over Clemson. I think it goes down to like the 4th tiebreaker for that to happen. And so that makes Clemson's job tough because that means that they need Miami to lose, most likely, or for SMU to lose. And then I don't know exactly how the tiebreaker math would work out there. So, and that doesn't even count, by the way, like you said, a game against South Carolina, which is not a conference game, but still is going to hurt their case, certainly. And they also go on the road to Pitt. And Pitt looks like they might be broken. Like they might just be done after this past week. But I do think that like that's not a gimme. And by the way, when you look at Clemson's resume to this point, I think that they have 1 win over a team with a winning record at this point. Virginia Tech might have made it too. But NC State was previously their only win over a team with a winning record. And that's actually no, Virginia Tech moved to 5 and 5.
Yeah, Virginia Tech's 50-50
So-
thanks to that
so-
loss.
So never mind. It's just NC State. And actually, I'm gonna double check to make sure. Oh nope, NC State is now 5 and 5 after losing this past week. So so they have 0 wins over teams with winning records at this point. Congratulations to Clemson.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, at least Pitt has so many wins already banked up that
Yes,
they won't
they won't
have a
500.
losing record at any point in the rest of the season. Oh my goodness. What a any other games we've missed? One thing I will say, Boise State's got an interesting situation because right now, I mean, obviously Nevada they're not a great record, but we did see them put the fear of a loss in SMU at the open the season, and that's why that BYU loss I think made SMU's the shine really come off of them early in the season. But rest of their schedule, they've got at San Jose State this upcoming week, and that one could be interesting. San Jose State had a really nice performance against Oregon State this past weekend, and again, I'm only mentioning that to say who could potentially challenge Boise State in a run to potentially quite plausibly be the 4 seed if things kind of go the way they could go in the Big 12 and ACC, as well as they have a game at just a miserable Wyoming team. Then they close out hosting Oregon State, which has been okay. They have been an okay Mountain West team, even though they're not in the Mountain West. I'm curious to see. I think that might be it because other than the Army Notre Dame game, I think the most important G5 game would be this San Jose State this upcoming weekend.
Yeah, it's gonna be an interesting finish to the year. And I think that the other piece too that's gonna be fascinating is certainly right now they are the runaway winners and the runaway leaders for the group of fives berth. I think it will be interesting too to see where they rank this upcoming week as well, to see if they give themselves any leeway if they were to lose the Mountain West. Because again, this is a team that has to win the Mountain West in order to get that auto bid. And even when we talk about Miami or BYU or SMU or any of these teams, right, we have to assume a conference championship game result as well. So Yeah, this game against San Jose State's going to be pretty interesting for them. Again, something that might actually help them a little bit is that, do you know who is tied for first place right now in the Mountain West with them?
Colorado State?
It's Colorado State. They are undefeated right now in Mountain West play, which is very weird. Very weird. UNLV is behind them because they have that loss to Boise State. And Colorado State closes with Wyoming at Fresno State, which Fresno State picked up a bad loss this weekend, and versus Utah State. So they have a really good shot of still being undefeated. And Boise State versus Colorado State probably will not be a very competitive football game. I think that Boise State will absolutely destroy Colorado State. Not because Colorado State's bad, I just think that their matchups would be really good. Right? You're telling me that those Boise State pass rushers are going to play against an air raid? I would take that. I would take that. You're telling me, right? Like Colorado State has made improvements on defense, but like Ashton Genty's going to have a lot more fun against that defense than he would against UNLV. So at this point, it probably is just a battle of stay undefeated.
I totally forgot San Jose State's head coach is Ken Niumatalolo. I totally forgot
He's
that's where he
doing a
ended
great
up.
job.
Yeah, no, and I mean, because I'm like, why is San Jose State doing so well? And then you're like, oh, right, okay. Because it was, by the way, his coaching, especially after Navy let him go. I love that he went and like decided, I'm going to learn how to be a modern coach and just be on I forgot which team was he with, like sitting as kind of observing and learning about how to basically, how to kind of upgrade his coaching methodology. And that paid off for the Spartans. What can I say? That's a tough place to win too. I mean, because it is tough because for those who don't realize, the salaries at a G5 are good, but not great. And San Jose State is one of the most expensive places in the United States. So I was hearing it from some of the other Mountain West coaches were telling me confidentially at one of the media days years ago, like, that's a tough job because you're either looking for empty nesters or young guys who can afford to live in like a tiny apartment. Because you just can't, your mind just doesn't go that far in the place.
And I want people to understand, yes, like we're talking about like, they're probably making six figures, but like that's not special in San Jose. That's not special.
You compete against all the Google, all the Meta, all the all the Apple money that's there. Yeah, and so all their like regular Joe Blow employees are also making similar amounts of money, but also so it drives up everything. Oh my goodness. The joys of being Silicon Valley's team.
and by the way, if you wanna build a new facility, you gotta go ahead and buy the land for that, and that is not an easy task. Anyway, shout out to San Jose. My wife's from there.
Well, you know what? I think this has been a good moment to sort of wrap this one up. The bottom line is there's lots of great games coming up, and we can thank this 12-team playoff. It has given us so much enjoyment, and to an extent, I am one of the people that does believe the portal has also spread enough of the talent around to make so many of these teams contenders. The SEC, the results we're seeing in the SEC is the portal and NIL kind of spreading out talent enough where no team seems to quite have enough players to just roll through the season unscathed. But as we wrap this up, I wanted to thank all of you for listening. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you're hearing us. And you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at CBSSports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Irie, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB, the official fan voice of the Gasparilla Bowl. We just announced that today, right before we went on there. But hope you all have a great one. Take care.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.